Alton Towers here in the UK is one of my favourite theme parks anywhere in the world for the fact that because of local council regulations, it can't build any ride attractions above the tree limit at the park, the tree line, and therefore it has, over its history, had to become really unique in terms of what new coasters and rides it adds to the park. Because of these regulations and restrictions, for certain attractions they've had to build downwards, things like Oblivion, things like Nemesis, Galactica, Wicker Man. And for that reason, it has forced the park into probably adding different coasters and attractions that no other park anywhere in the world would have added, because they have to work within these very tight functions. And I was speaking to one of my subscribers over the past few weeks, Star Wars Maniac, shout out to you, thank you very much for subscribing and watching all the videos. And we were talking about what would happen if Alton Towers had no height limit. Would the park have added the same different coasters and rides over the past few years on throughout their history, or would, if the park had no height limit, add completely different rides and attractions? So what I'm going to be doing today is just a quick video talking about the coasters that they've currently got at the park. I'm not going to focus on things like the dark rides and whatever, because you know, they're all within buildings, but I'm going to go through the main coasters at the park and talk about whether or not I think they would have stayed the same, whether they would have been added at all to the park if there was no height limit. I'd love to hear your thoughts and feedback on all of my opinions down below. Do you agree with me, what I'm going to say in today's video, or maybe you think completely differently? If you do enjoy today's video, please do give it a like. It massively helps out the channel. Subscribe to Coasternaut for more videos like this in the future. Thank you very much for watching, and let's get into today's video. So firstly, what I'm going to talk about is actually flat rides before we get into the overall coaster collection at the park. Another coaster enthusiast I was speaking to the other day was speaking about how they'd love to see a Zampala Discovery flat ride come to the park, and I was just telling them, you know, because of the restrictions that are within Alton Towers, we would never unfortunately be able to see that come to the park. I think one thing we can talk about is, obviously we've talked about for years how Alton Towers desperately needs new flat rides. We've had the Retro Squad for years now, and the park definitely needs a new selection of thrilling flat rides, modern day flat rides. I think a lot of different flat rides would come to the park. Every flat ride we have seen at the park has been something like a top spin or something smaller, an actual flat ride that's on the ground. I think we would have seen maybe a Starflyer or a drop tower, things which you can find at most of the theme parks, not as unique coming to Alton Towers if it had no height limit. And I think before we get into the coasters, I think that is just what would happen to the park as a whole. I think it would lose its unique aspect. Alton Towers, for me, is one of the best parks anywhere in the world, not necessarily because of the rides it has, but because of how unique all the rides it has. There's an argument to be made that a lot of the coasters out there, obviously we have a B&M Invert, we have a dive coaster, we have a Gerstlauer Infinity. There's a lot of arguments to be made out there, GCI wooden coaster, that a lot of these coaster models that can be found at multiple other parks offer better versions of those coaster models. However, that's not the point. The fact that these coasters are so unique, how we've managed to get a B&M Invert coaster, a B&M dive coaster in a park that can't build above the tree line is so fantastic to me. And I think if it was to lose its height limit, it would lose a lot of its uniqueness, and it would just become a standard other theme park. And I think that's you know, almost helped out the park in the fact that it's got its height limit. It's been forced into having to adapt to these regulations and rules and build very unique rides and attractions. Starting with Oblivion then, I think Oblivion probably we still would have built with the first ever dive coaster. I just think it would have been very different. I think rather than digging a big hole into the ground, I think they would have just built it completely above ground. There is obviously one other clone of Oblivion over in Asia, Diving Coaster G5 I believe it's called, and that's all above ground. It looks a bit odd because we're so used to seeing Oblivion go into the tunnel. Maybe would have seen some inversions on that, similar to something like SheiKra over in Florida. Who knows? Maybe, I'm not quite sure if the park would have looked at adding versions to this coaster or not, because at the minute, anyone that knows Oblivion, it's literally you go up your lift hill, you turn around, you go down, you dive, and then it's an overbank turn into the brake run. Maybe if the park had more area to work with, they would have built it above ground, they would have added something like an Immelman and some other inversions, but I do still think we would have seen a dive coaster come to the park. Let's look at Nemesis and Galactica now. Again, I'm talking about these because it's one of the first B&M inverts and the first B&M flying coaster. Similar to Oblivion, I think these coasters probably still would have been built, but I think we would have seen something very different. In terms of Galactica, maybe we wouldn't have seen something quite on the scale of something like Tatsu or Manta, because they're much more modern flying coasters in comparison to Galactica, because it was the very first one. When I'm not saying we would have seen a massive pretzel loop or something, but I just think we would have seen a larger version of what we got with Galactica. And Nemesis is an interesting one because I think, you know, we would have, again, probably as boring as it sounds, probably still got a B&M invert, but it would have just been on a larger scale. Something similar to maybe the Batman clones. I'm not sure they would have gone with something absolutely huge like Raptor just yet over at Cedar Point, but something similar to the Batman clones would have happened, I think. And I think that's how we would see Nemesis. Wicker Man is one of the coasters which, surprisingly, I could see staying the same if there was or was not a height limit. I think a lot of people would say, oh no, they wouldn't. They would have built a larger GCI. That plot of land that Wicker Man is on isn't very big. I think that's pretty much the biggest coaster they could have built in that land. Alton does love its theming, does love to immerse riders in a storyline with their coasters, not just to build a thrilling coaster. They like to have all the backstory there as well, all the theming elements around, and I think they probably would have had to go with a coaster around that size to go in there. It is obviously the only wooden coaster in the park, the first wooden coaster to be built in the UK in over 20 years, obviously Megaphobia at Oakwood. I think they still would have gone with that investment because the UK desperately needed a new wooden coaster. Alton Towers desperately needed a wooden coaster. All of their coasters before that were steel. They needed something different with the airtime and the different sort of forces it exerts on your body compared to a steel coaster. So I think they probably still would have gone for Wicker Man. Exact same layout and everything, because I just don't see them being possible to build a bigger coaster there. There is the argument that potentially, yes, they wouldn't have. Anyone that knows Wicker Man, the lift hill is a bit unique and a bit weird. It sort of starts off quite steep and then sort of shallows out, and it changes at the angle of ascent when it's going up the lift hill. Maybe it would have kept on going up at a steeper angle and therefore it would have been slightly taller. But I think other than a slight change in layout, maybe a bit taller, I think Wicker Man would have stayed largely the same. I think actually the bigger thing to talk about with the major coasters is the Smiler. This is the only coaster I'm not sure they would have built at all. Obviously at the minute they've had to build it very small. It's had to have 2 different lift hills. There's a pre-lift section, so it's essentially a coaster with 3 parts. They've essentially built 3 sort of separate coasters. I'm not sure the Smiler would have been built at all if they had the choice to, you know, if they still wanted to go out there and break the inversion record. I don't think this is what they would have gone with at all. If you look at just down at Thorpe Park, Colossus, that was obviously the first coaster in the world to break the 10 inversion record, and that is a lot larger than the Smiler. You could probably maybe fit 2, maybe 3 Smilers on the plot of land of the Colossus. I don't think 3, I think it's definitely probably 2. But you know, I just can't see them have gone with this layout. Maybe they still would have gone with the Gerstlauer Infinity, but I think it would have been maybe something on the scale of Karnen over at Hansa Park in Germany. I think it would have been a completely different style of ride. It definitely wouldn't have stayed as low to the ground as it is. I think it would have been a lot taller if they did still want to break the inversion record. I think Rita would have been very similar to Stealth or something like Top Thrill Dragster. I think they would have just sort of, rather than having a low to the ground twist and turns layout, I think they would have gone straight up into a top hat and back down again. I think that would have been something similar to what we've seen with Stealth down at Thorpe Park. What do you think though? Do you think all the coasters would have stayed the same? Do you think there would have been a lot of changes? Do you think they would have gone with a completely different coaster lineup? Do you think, you know, we wouldn't have got any of these coasters? No B&M Dive, no Invert, no GCI. I'd love to hear your thoughts and feedback down in the comment section below. Alton Towers is one of my favourite parks anywhere in the world, and I truly think without its height limit it would be a much worse park. It would lose all of its uniqueness, and for that I'm really glad actually that it does have its height limit, because it's forced them into becoming one of the best and most unique theme parks anywhere in the world, with one of the most unique and best ride collections anywhere in the world. Thank you very much for watching today's video. If you did enjoy, please do give it a like. Thank you very much for Star Wars Maniac for giving me this sort of inspiration to come on here and do this little discussion video with you guys. Thank you very much. If anyone else wants to suggest any sort of video concepts to me, I'd love to hear you, and I'll shout you out in the video as well. Thank you very much for watching. Subscribe for the Coasternaut for more videos in the future, and I'll see you very much in the next one.